Ed grew up in the lovely Finger Lakes region of western New York and developed a deep love for the natural world. Since moving to Maine from England in 2007, he has been exploring and writing extensively about the creatures that live here, and has written 2 books on that subject. And so we're so lucky to have him here tonight to teach us about Iceland if you haven't been there. I've never been there, so anyway. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Okay, we'll get right into it. I have to say I'd rather be in Iceland tonight than here.
Yeah.
Because it's probably about 60 degrees there instead of 90 or whatever the heck it got to here. But I hope you enjoy this presentation. This is a nearly 3-week trip Mary and I took last year in June. And we were very lucky. We put our rain gear on once, and that was a little missed when we were out whale watching. Sometimes people go there and they wear their rain gear every day, so we had no complaints.
Great.
So let's talk about where Iceland is located, so that we have that in our minds. It's a long way from here, and as you can see, it's just below the Arctic Circle. Parts of Iceland, some of the outer islands, actually span the Arctic Circle. So it's a long way north. If you talk about Svalbard, northern Norway, and their big island that actually sits up here, that's even further north, but only the really intrepid go there. Iceland was basically a blank canvas until the 800s. Nobody knows when the first Irish monks went there, but when the first Vikings got there from Norway, they found a few Irish monks settling there. These Irish monks were pretty intrepid. They sailed in little curricos, they're called them. It's basically a round hide boat. And I can't imagine taking on the North Atlantic all the way from Ireland to Iceland, but some of them survived. The Vikings made sure to get rid of the Irish monks because they didn't want their religion and they didn't want to share the islands with anybody. When they got there, Iceland was covered with trees. Not today. As you can imagine, they cut every tree in sight because they were building ships, they were building houses and barns and burning firewood, etc., etc. So, like Scotland and a number of other places, the land was really decimated, to use that term, by the Vikings, but they were trying to survive. They actually exported some lumber to Norway. So why did they go there? Well, there was a very aggressive king petty king, I guess you'd say, in Norway who was trying to consolidate small kingdoms very aggressively, and his method was, you're either going to join me or you're going to die. And that wasn't all that popular, of course, so some people got in their ships and left. When they got there, they couldn't believe what they found. The waters off Iceland were just teeming with fish, a little bit like descriptions of what the early Portuguese and other wayfarers found when they came to Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and the coast of Maine. You could just about walk on top of the fish there. I mean, huge cod, 5-6 feet long fish. Fortunately, the Icelandic people have done a better job managing their fish resources, so it's still a major part of their economy, about 50%. Tourism is the other major portion of that. You can see the racks of cod here drying in the sun. They were fairly pungent.
Is that still happening? Is that
Oh, yeah.
how they dry it?
Yeah, yeah. The other thing that they found were unbelievable numbers of birds. I've illustrated a couple here because these are birds that we're familiar with here in Maine. The puffin, of course, and the common eider. They are everywhere, and it's not particularly difficult to see them if you're out and about. So that's pretty cool. I'll show you later more on the puffins, or on the eiders. At the time the Vikings landed in Norway, there was only one mammal there. One mammal. Think of that. That's pretty unusual. Is this beautiful Arctic fox, which is smaller than the red foxes and gray foxes that we have here, only about 10 pounds. Their colors change quite a bit seasonally. They'll go from a brownish, tawny color in the summer. Most of them will turn kind of a silver, white color. You made it, Chip. Yeah. And we didn't see many Arctic fox because they tend to live in the more remote areas. There's parts of Iceland where you just can't go unless you're willing to walk through very aggressive terrain to get there. No roads in the interior of Iceland. We'll illustrate that here. So just to get you located, it's 2,400 miles as the crow flies from here. And it's about 40,000 square miles, roughly the size of Maine. Okay? We have 1.3 million people. They have 353. So it's quite sparsely populated. And when you look at the numbers, the vast majority of the people live around Reykjavik, down on the peninsula where Keflavik, the international airport, is, and Selfoss. So this area right here. When you go up in this part of Iceland, you can often have it all to yourself, which is perfect as far as I'm concerned. They have some of the largest waterfalls in Europe. They have some of the largest glaciers in Europe on this small little island. It's really a very diverse place. The language in Iceland is Old Norse. They still speak the same language that they brought there in the 800s. They didn't have many influences on them in the early years, and they actually were pretty clever about documenting their language. There are some chronicles called the sagas. You may have heard of these Icelandic sagas. I've read all of them that I could find translated into English. I studied Swedish for a couple of years when I lived in England, and I can't understand Old Norse. It is that different. I can make a little sense of it in writing, but to speak, forget it. It's a very different language. Okay, so some of the wildlife here. This is a bird that we don't have. Occasionally one will wander all the way to Maine, but they're beautiful little creatures, about the size of a wood duck or what's another small duck? It'll come to me in a minute, but quite small, and a diving duck, meaning they're not dabbling on the surface, they're diving down to get mollusks and insects and things. The female doesn't have much of a tuft, but this guy looks like he's got a mohawk going. He's pretty sharp. And obviously that gets a little more pronounced during breeding season. He's trying to show off and win a fair maiden's heart, but all year long he's got that tuft. This is another bird. Now you'll see horned grebes in a lot of places. They're not unique to Iceland, but I particularly enjoyed my encounter with this one. I had a guide for birding one day. We left Iceland and went to a couple of the nearby peninsulas, and this guy was a retired policeman, a wonderful photographer, and just a delight to spend the whole day with. He had run the major crimes and drug unit in Reykjavik before his retirement, and I suspect he was glad to be out of there and doing something outdoor. But we found this nest on a little pond we went to. You can see these plastic stakes. Those are driven into the ground so the birds can build a nest in here. Here's the female and here's the male. And this little guy who's would fit in my hands very aggressively protecting his nest. As soon as we got there, he started charging in the water right at us like, what are you doing here? And when we didn't make a move to leave, he started splashing around, ducking his head, and making it quite clear he didn't want us near there. During the breeding season, they get these tufts of feathers here. It's not really a horn, but that's obviously where the name comes from. Pretty cool little guy. So, I mentioned waterfalls. If you're going to go to Iceland, you're going to see some pretty spectacular waterfalls. This one is on a river called Hvita, And the name of the waterfall is Gullfoss. That stands for gold, the gold waterfall. And they think that historically it's because chieftains trying to woo some of their people to convert to Christianity were throwing their golden idols into the river at the base of the falls. I'm not going to go looking for them, but there's another drop here that you can't see. So it's a pretty substantial waterfall. In the fast water below that waterfall is a duck that we get here in Maine, in the winter especially. If you go down the coast, York and places like that, you'll see harlequins. I've only seen one here in Harpswell, but they are gorgeous birds. And they live in fast, rocky water. It's completely different from most ducks. They'll build their nest right on the shore of a really fast area, and like other ducks, they're eating crustaceans, insects, and mollusks. Very, very handsome bird. Okay, a couple others that we saw in this place. We went to see the first of the waterfalls on our itinerary. There's this area called the Golden Circle where everybody has to go because you get geysers, you get waterfalls, and you get Tingvellir, which is the site of the original Viking Parliament, going back to 880, still in place and still functioning as their primary government. We don't have any other parliament in the world that is as long-lived as that. So you've got the Wimbrel. We see Wimbrels in this country, but this is the Eurasian version of that. And this beautiful little bird, the European golden plover. This is like the swallows returning to Capistrano. Every year when the first golden plover returns to Iceland and somebody can document it, it's all over the newspapers, all over the TV, because summer must be coming. It's a big deal after a long...
Where do they stay? Where's it coming from?
They'll migrate to England, Scotland.
Oh.
Yeah. I don't know if we'd ever see one here. It would be pretty unusual if they came this far. Ireland, places like that.
And when does summer start there and how long does it last?
I'm sorry?
When does summer start there and how long does it last?
Well,
That's what
if you're going to go there, May is okay. It's going to be cool and it may be damp, but you won't have as many tourists. I'd like to go back in September because that apparently is still pretty good weather. It's much quieter after Labor Day, of course. And you get colors in the vegetation things that would make it a very pretty place.
But summer would be June, July, and August.
Yeah, it's pretty short.
Yeah.
It's like going to the High Rockies. So here's the big geyser, Strokur Geyser. This is where we get the name for our geysers out in Yellowstone. One exploded last week, just after we left Yellowstone. I'm glad I wasn't standing there when that happened. Like here, historically, they used to manipulate their geysers. This used to erupt very faithfully, and I'm using that term as a pun, I guess, but every 5 minutes or so it would erupt, and it would go 70, 80 feet in the air. But they wanted to manipulate it so it would perform more spectacularly, so they used to dump soap flakes and things like that into the geyser, and it damaged the geyser. So now it's a much smaller eruption. This is probably 40 feet, and it's more irregular. It might go every 10, 15 minutes, 20 minutes. And I wouldn't be surprised if the one that blew up out in Yellowstone suffered from the same kind of treatment, and it changes the mineral configuration underground of these geysers when you're messing around with them. This is a beautiful area to walk. There were hot springs and beautiful pools and mud pits as well all over. We took a couple-mile walk up on top on this hill and saw some very nice birds out there. So when we left that area, the Golden Circle, we headed down the coast further to this beautiful place below Myrdalsjökull. I'm sure you can all say that. Myrdalsjökull Glacier. And that's the glacier up on top. Now it doesn't look like much right now, but Not that long ago, it was a very famous place because of a massive eruption that took place in 2010 and managed to close airports all over Western Europe. Some of the airports in the UK, we weren't living there at that point, but we had friends living there, and they said, you know, there were weeks that went by, you just couldn't fly because so much of that ash was headed that way. And when you look at the glacier today and some of the downstream areas, it still looks like it happened yesterday. Pretty spectacular. It wasn't an explosive eruption, it was more ash, but still a problem. Luckily for them, most of it went out to sea and was somebody else's problem, not the Icelandic people's problem. So this is the Mýrdalsjökull Glacier. We drove around the peninsula to approach it in our specialized vehicles, basically a big panel van with four-wheel drive and big knobby tires. And they were able to drive right up to the base of the volcano, or excuse me, the glacier, and then we walked up to it. You know, that's ice underneath there, but you wouldn't know that from all the ash on top of it. And you can see water dripping off there. It was pretty interesting to visit that. Well, I've been to glaciers in Switzerland, for instance, and those are just gorgeous. The brilliant blue, white color. These have got too much ash on them.
How long will these last, Ed? This glacier?
Some of these are shrinking, of course. I don't think they're shrinking as much as those in Western Europe, in the Alps, for instance, but they're definitely losing mass.
So they will eventually
Well, unfortunately, that's probably the case. Now, it's interesting, when we went to Patagonia, some of their glaciers are actually increasing in size. And I understand some of the Greenland glaciers are increasing while others are shrinking. So it's a very incomplete picture of what's happening with glaciers. Mary here is toasting with some of this glacier water and a very particular Icelandic alcoholic drink, like schnapps or aquavit. It was pretty powerful. I stayed away from that. She enjoyed it.
coming out of the rocks?
Huh?
That was coming out of the rock?
Well, the guy had the alcohol with him, but we took the water right off the glacier.
Okay. I didn't see you down there with your mom.
No. So, one of the things about Iceland, they've made some of the same mistakes we did in managing our environment. They wanted to beautify some of their landscapes, and they wanted to improve their soil. When you have a major eruption there, it can take thousands of years before the lava gradually breaks down into something that could be useful for agriculture, even for trees. So, knowing the reputation of lupins, as we have here, they can handle very alkaline soil, and they're very good at improving the soil. What they didn't count on when they imported these from Alaska is that, as with a lot of invasive plants, they just took over. And they're crowding out a lot of the low ground plants that are native to Iceland. They'd like to do something about it, but it's too late because the lupins are everywhere now. Very pretty when they're in bloom, as they were for us, but not such a good story. In this part of the country, we saw a lot of these beautiful birds called the white wagtail. Not surprisingly, like an eastern phoebe, if you're familiar with that bird. They'll sit there on the lines or on a post and wag their tails at you. Cute little devils.
What size?
Hmm?
What size?
Oh, very small, you know, like that. They're not very big. Okay, so along the coast, lots of scenery here. Most of it is lava, of course, running down to the sea from these huge volcanoes. And we saw harbor porpoises, so you can see those same species that we'd have here in the harbors. But they also had blue whales, and that would be a pretty unusual sighting off the coast of Maine. Occasionally that happens, but we weren't lucky enough to see one of those. But the lava has been worked and shaped over thousands and thousands of years into all kinds of shapes. A lot of these arches and bridges and things. There's a number of these out in the ocean, and the story is that they are trolls that were turned into rock because they misbehaved. Now you chuckle, but they did a survey of the Icelandic people. 75% of the Icelandic people believe that trolls and dwarves exist. And even if they're not too sure about it, they're still willing to allow for the possibility. So you drive in the country and you'll see signs sometimes next to little bridges that this bridge is occupied by this particular troll. And it's kind of a warning. They say, well, maybe you don't want to go underneath that bridge and mess about with this troll because he may play a dirty trick on you. I'm kind of betwixt and between, you know. Okay, a couple more gorgeous waterfalls. Now remember, we were there in June, and it was quite dry then. We hadn't had a lot of rain in their spring, so these waterfalls were, if you will, a shadow of what they would have been right after winter with heavy spring rains, snow melt, etc. But they were still pretty impressive. This one has a cave behind it. You can see some people standing there. Mary wanted to enjoy the thrill of getting soaked by walking behind it. I stood out and looked at some birds on the cliff, but they all came back pretty wet. This one has a huge pool at the base of it. It must really be quite a glacier, or quite a waterfall when it's going. Okay, starting to talk a little bit more about some of the birds. You know, they have birds there that look like birds here, these gulls, but this is a different species. This is called a common gull. You'll notice it doesn't have the red-orange base to the beak that we have. I was lucky enough to catch one with a couple of chicks underneath it. But I was most impressed by the way they nest on these cliffs. These cliffs actually tipped inward, and they do that to avoid predators, of course. It's much harder for some of the raptors to get a hold of them. So you can imagine at times the chicks will fall out of a nest and go tumbling down these cliffs, but that's life in the big city, I guess. We do occasionally get the common or the mew gull here, and the Icelandic gull is quite common here in the winter. It's one of the so-called white gulls, very pretty bird. But we didn't actually see an Icelandic gull because they're not there in the summer. Lava fields everywhere you go. Lava in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and you can see, you know, constant scenes of the erosion of lava. I really got a kick out of this one. It's shaped like tubular rods of lava coming out sideways. Sometimes you'll see these in a vertical fashion. Now, maybe this had been flipped on its side over years of pressure and constant shifting of the earth, but that was pretty cool. So, I mentioned the conversion of lava to soil. It takes forever. And there are places like this on the left where even the Icelandic people and the Icelandic horses don't go because it is treacherous. If you tried to walk there, you'd be lucky not to break your ankle. It is really slick, both because of the shape of the rocks and the crevices and things, but you've got all this algae all over it, and of course if it's wet, it would be even more dangerous. So they don't go there. You know, they won't go there for a long time until it gradually begins to break down. You can see in this case where some grasses are starting to take foot here, and they can cut that for feed for their animals. And this is another import, an aspen from Alaska. They didn't learn their lesson with the lupins. They wanted to bring aspen. In this case, it wasn't a bad deal. To my knowledge, the aspen haven't taken off as some invasive species can be, and they use them as windbreaks, as here. They use them for firewood, etc. It's a much shorter aspen than the ones that we would have here. Okay, one of my favorite areas. Now we're up in the northwest part of the country here in a region called Stickisholmer. We had great weather there. You see it's kind of overcast, but it really was very pleasant weather there. More waterfalls, everywhere you go, waterfalls. Our bus driver seemed to have an encyclopedic knowledge of waterfalls, so we'd be driving along and he'd say, "Stop, we've got to go over here and see this waterfall." So we'd all pile out of the bus and go over there. This is an interesting bird, the black-legged kittiwake. And we have those here if you're in the harbor in Booth Bay, for instance, or out to Bar Harbor, you'll see the black-legged kittiwake with his beautiful black tail. Very handsome bird. But this gives you an idea of some of the vast landscapes that you can see in Iceland. There are places there where you can see beyond the horizon. And it's quite a stark but beautiful place in its own regard. One of the highlights of this place was the Shark Museum. And a very particular shark called the Greenland shark that we don't see here, but they exist in the waters around Iceland and Greenland and so on. And long ago they learned to harvest these sharks as a source of protein. Unfortunately, a lot of people were killed before they realized that they had to treat the meat and preserve it over months because it has a very high concentration of ammonia, and people were dying from eating this shark meat. So here you are with big pieces of shark hanging from the rafters of this building here. It's been in this one family for generations. They give a delightful tour. They've got kind of a marine museum in the building there, as well as all the shark, and then of course they give you a sample of the shark meat with a zip of this aquavit. All I can say about the shark is that it's probably an acquired taste. it's a little sharp in flavor, and we didn't bring any home. But, maybe you would like it.
And don't those sharks get very old as well?
Yep.
They have a very long lifespan?
Probably. I mean, they're huge, huge. I don't know specifically, but my guess is that they would. And in that cold water, you know, their development would be slower than if they were living in the equator. We stopped for lunch one day out in this western peninsula, and as is my wont, I wolfed down my lunch, ran outside with my camera and my binoculars to try to see who was flying around and get some pictures of wildlife. This day I was particularly bold, and I nearly paid the price for it. Right there is an Arctic tern. Anybody know about the Arctic tern?
No.
These guys are very aggressive. Around here we have the common terns. Sometimes you'll see the roseate tern, etc. But when they're nesting, the Arctic tern turns into a bully, and they will attack you at the slightest provocation. Handsome bird, but you better be wearing a hat, and you better be prepared to run if you're anywhere near their nest, because they will swoop in. They'll draw blood on your head if they hit you with their beak. I'm told that on the golf courses there, if they're playing near the sea, the guys walk around with a golf club in their hand doing this to try to keep the terns away from them. We had some interesting experiences with them. Two of them drove me to my knees in the parking lot to avoid them. They would have been right on my head if I had not ducked down. This is along a river later in the trip. This one shows the attitude.
How big is it? Is it 6
They're
inches high?
same size as our terns, you know. They're, with the tail, they're only about that long. It's not a big bird, but they've got an attitude, a chip on their shoulder. And so, you know, here's one attacking us near Reykjavik at this little marshy area. Here's one attacking me along the river where I walk. Here's one attacking me along the sea. They can give a good account of themselves for a little bird. And if there's a baby near there, you better get out of town, because they're going to be right on top of you. A couple other birds that I enjoy, the common ringed plover, similar to the plovers that you'll see here. They were very relaxed around humans, and that's true of most of the wildlife there. Because there's relatively few humans, when you get out into the countryside, the birds aren't really threatened by you. You can approach quite close to some of them. The Eurasian oyster catcher is similar to oyster catchers we have in this country. Very pretty and quite noisy. They're flying around all the time, and I enjoyed watching them. Eiders, I mentioned eiders before. You certainly know that eider down has been used in pillows and comforters for a long, long time. In Iceland, they still collect eider down. And one reason why that's easy is that there, rather than nesting offshore on reefs and shoals and things like that, the eiders nest along the roadside and parks and grassy areas. Literally, you could just walk up and find a nest with all this beautiful down there and the eider eggs there. So it is still a common form of
Insulation.
income for country people in Iceland. These are birds a little smaller than the bald eagle, but pretty similar in terms of configuration. They have the white tail that our bald eagle does, but you'll notice they don't have the white heads that ours do. These guys were fighting over something, I don't know, but not many of them left. As with here, they used to shoot the eagles and other raptors to protect their sheep. And they're protected now, starting to come back, but it's obviously taking a long time for their populations to recover. This is a pretty area. We stayed at a horse farm here in this area, the Vidhistaltunga Valley. And it was beautiful. The wildflower season was on us. This beautiful waterfall that ran down through a canyon for probably a mile. Quite steep. I mean, 40, 50-foot drop down there. And I took a long walk one afternoon, and then again the next morning along the lower part of the river, and it was just loaded with birds of all sorts. I really enjoyed that. It's also a very famous salmon fishing river. The big deal in this area are the Icelandic horses, not ponies. If you want to offend an Icelandic farmer, you refer to them as ponies. They're small, they look like what we would call a pony, but they're horses. And they are purebred. They were imported from Norway all those years ago, and they do not allow horses of any breed to be brought into Iceland. They export a few and sell a few. Somebody was mentioning they'd seen them in Scotland. But you're not allowed to take your favorite Arabian or any other horse into Iceland. They want to protect these horses. They're much smaller than what we're used to as a thoroughbred, but they're very sturdy, tough creatures, and they still raise them for riding, farming, ranching, etc.
They're not wild.
Some of them are.
Some are.
Yeah, when you get to the inner portions of the country, you'll see wild horses running around. They do roundups occasionally, as we do out west, to try to control their numbers because, of course, they can strip vegetation. They don't want that to happen, but there's a lot of wild ones. This is a bird I enjoyed a lot. It's called a redwing. It's similar to the robin. You can see the color here on the breast. And very similar habits, very similar song. Every morning you'd hear the redwings singing around, and it was like the early wake-up call. Now, because of the time of year, wake-up call from the thrushes is somewhere around 2:30 in the morning. So you better not have your windows open or you're going to be awake very early there.
Do these guys eat worms like robins?
Oh yeah,
Worms.
and insects, of course, when they're nesting. But if you have trouble sleeping, you better take good eye shades and sleeping pills to Iceland because it's a short night. This is another bird I enjoyed spending time with, the common redshank. You see the long, skinny legs. They, very wary and very noisy. Anytime you got near them, they'd start squawking and obviously didn't want you around their nest at all. I had to really work to get a couple decent pictures of these guys because they didn't want you anywhere near them, unusual by the standards of local wildlife. Traditional housing. You will still see in many villages the traditional stone, sod roofed houses. And these are not just in museums, people live in these. I don't know what the reality of trying to take care of one of those houses would be, but I've got to believe it requires some maintenance on a regular basis. But it was pretty cool to see those. When we were in the far north of Iceland, they took us on a whale watching trip one day, and this was really fun. It was misting. It was the worst day of our trip, but they have these fantastic suits that they put you in, waterproof and insulated, a little bit like a snowmobile suit. And so we were perfectly warm while we were out there. We'd been warned to take gloves and stocking caps and things like that. But this is one of the ships there. And they take you out in this fjord, and depending on the day and the wind and the waves, they may take you out in the open ocean as well. We didn't need to go all the way out in the open ocean because we managed to see creatures closer to land than that. The day before, they'd seen a blue whale, and I was hoping to see one, but we did not. But we did see these beautiful white-beaked dolphins. These are pretty substantial dolphins compared to the ones you'll see around here. 750 pounds, that's a lot of dolphin. We probably saw 30 or 40 of them repeatedly around the ship. Must have been a school of herring or mackerel, something there, because they never really left. They just moved around as the ship moved around. One day as we were driving along, I spotted a pod of orcas in the ocean just off the shoreline. And everybody got very excited about that, of course. They're actually a dolphin. We call them killer whales, but they're not whales. They're actually dolphins. But here's the star of the show. We saw 2 humpback whales. And at times, this whale was so close to the ship, I couldn't photograph him because he was literally below me. And I wasn't right on the railing. Somebody was in front of me, so I had to wait until this whale moved away from the railing. Fortunately, I was taller than they were. But to see this humpback whale right next to the ship and breaching and diving and blowing water out the blowholes here was pretty exciting. That's easily the closest I've ever been to a whale. And here's the humpback breaching. They told us that when they're relaxed and they're not being pursued or pressed, they tend to rise 3 times, and then on the 3rd time they'll come out of the water in what's called a breach, and that's when you see their flukes or their tail fins. And we saw that repeatedly as this large whale and then another smaller one later was around in our area. I wanted to show you this. You've probably read that scientists can identify whales by their coloration and body shape and so on. This is the big humpback, and this is the smaller one. And you can see there's a very distinct difference between them. So you'd have no trouble telling which one it was.
Like a fingerprint.
Yeah, exactly. Another cool bird, the northern fulmar. We'll occasionally get that off the coast of Maine, but not close inshore very often. They're similar to the petrels and shearwaters, which we'll also have offshore. Pretty cool bird. They look a little bit like a gull, but they're quite different. And the primary difference is right here. They have this tube on top of their beak, and they're adapted so that they can separate salt from the water and the food that they're taking in. Too much salt would obviously be a problem in their diet. And they have the ability to eject that salty, fishy, oily mess onto an enemy. If they're threatened, they can blow this stuff out, and you ain't getting it off your clothes, apparently, and it really stinks. So I guess it's quite a pungent, effective weapon for them. Obviously, they don't have any other way of defending themselves. So in northern Iceland, there's some pretty fascinating areas up there. This is an area of very active geologic activity. We're there in mid-June. The day was probably 60 degrees, and you can see this particular stream is steaming with hot water coming out of the ground here. And there were mud pots and defunct mud pots in this area as well. Everywhere you went, you could see that kind of activity. There's a fault line in Iceland, and the two tectonic plates meet in the middle of Iceland. And we're standing astride it right here. I had to make sure that I could get on both the European tectonic plate and the North American tectonic plate. They're spreading, and you know, the continents are still moving. We still have drift, as it's called. And this was a very active area with all kinds of steam. I couldn't get more than about 20 feet away from this steam vent here. It was so hot and noisy as well. It was like, how do I describe it? I mean, steam was just shooting out of the ground. It really was painful to the ears. It was so loud. So a pretty fascinating area there.
And there's a smell of sulfur, right?
Hmm?
The smell of sulfur.
Oh yes, yeah, very common there. Other minerals as well, manganese, etc., but sulfur is obviously very prevalent. The Icelandic people are very clever at harnessing their geothermal power. They don't have solar power. They don't have wind power. They don't feel the need for it because about 90% of their power comes from these hot springs and deep wells that they build in the ground. And they harness it both to heat their houses and businesses, but also to generate electricity. They also have hydro. Some of those rivers I've shown you have dams on them, and they're making power there as well. But the big source of power in Iceland is geothermal. And they really are the world experts in that, and we're trying to learn from them to harness geothermal energy here in Maine, or in the United States. They don't have coal or gas plants at all. No plans to build them.
They have whole towns that are served by these.
Absolutely.
The whole village.
Absolutely. So here's another great waterfall, Gudafoss. This is the God's Fall. And the story goes that when one of the kings of Iceland wanted to convert all of his people to Christianity, he went there and threw all of his idols into the river. And it was a very effective way of getting people to convert to Christianity, because he said, if you don't convert to Christianity, I'm going to throw you in the river. So he got nearly complete conversion. It's an interesting leadership style.
Sounds familiar.
That was a pretty spectacular waterfall. I was very lucky here. One of the birds that I wanted to see here was the rock ptarmigan, similar to the willow ptarmigan that we have in northern Canada, Alaska, etc. And as we were walking back from Gudafoss to the bus, I happened to look to my right, and there on this boulder stood this bird. And I was like, thank you very much. I couldn't believe this. And there were people everywhere. But again, the bird just was relaxed around us. So this is the summer coloration. They look a little bit like a ruffed grouse or partridge, as we say here. They're bigger, but not dramatically so. But this is their winter plumage. They'll turn almost completely white in the winter. Very handsome bird. So if you're interested in wildlife, one place you have to go in Iceland is way up in the north, Lake Mývatn. And it's an area that's very active geologically, that all of those steam pots and geysers and things are around there. But it's, because of the size of the lake, it's a very popular place for waterfowl and other birds, and a major breeding and transit or migration zone. I would have liked to spend 3 or 4 days there. We didn't have that time. We only had a few hours to walk around one day, but very, very beautiful area.
Excuse me, when I was there, Mevatten was said to be a place to avoid because of the meaning of the word me,
Because,
of the meaning of the word me, mosquito.
well, if you're unlucky, yes. We had a breeze, and I never had a bite at all. But yes, you're right, they can be pretty serious there.
At the lake.
We had our head nets, but we fortunately didn't need them.
Good to know.
Enjoyed seeing this Eurasian widgeon. We have widgeons in this country as well, but a little different in coloration, and it was fun to see the babies literally right at my feet as I was walking along this path. The Barrow's goldeneye. This is a bird that we see here in Maine in the winter. I love to listen to them out on the water. You'll see them sometimes down by Salt Cod Cafe, for instance, along with the common goldeneye, but this is a particularly handsome bird during breeding season. And these little guys, the redneck phalarope. I mean, this bird literally would fit in your hand, but they're very bold. Several times I had them swim or walk right up to me and stand on the ground looking up at me like, what are you
What are
doing?
you doing? Take my picture.
They're surprising. You wouldn't be that lucky here. You'll see them out on the ocean here, but they're not going to be that relaxed and casual around humans. This is a bird I wish I had seen. Another raptor that used to be shot on sight and trapped and poisoned. It is the largest falcon in the world, and they were caught and shipped to the Middle East, particularly Saudi Arabia, for use in falconing. A single bird could be worth as much as $150,000. So you can imagine that was pretty tempting to people to catch these birds and ship them outside the country. Now they're protected, and they're starting to come back. I wasn't lucky enough to see them. They tend to inhabit the really rough, craggy areas up in the northwest where we didn't go. But my next trip to Iceland, I'm going to go looking for them. Spectacular birds. Okay, so I wanted to put the polar bear in here. Somebody asked me early on, do they have polar bears in Iceland? They don't, but sometimes one will arrive there on an ice floe. And you can imagine the consternation when you walk out of your cabin in northern Iceland one morning and there's a polar bear standing on the beach, or worse, on your front doorstep. These are massive bears. They dwarf the brown bears and the grizzlies that we're used to out west. Unfortunately, they can't repatriate them. So if a polar bear shows up in Iceland, they have to destroy it. There's no way effectively to capture it and ship it back to northern Greenland or the Arctic where it came from. Okay. One of the things about Iceland, of course, is that they have plenty of volcanoes, and it's a very active place. About 2 weeks after we left, this volcano erupted Fagradalsfall between the airport, Keflavik, and Reykjavik. And it caused a lot of trouble because it overwhelmed a couple of the highways there. It fractured one of the major pipelines that took heat and power to the south coast for the villages down there. And it kept erupting and putting out more lava. They actually had to build a wall in one place to try to save a new road that they put up. I don't know how that's worked, but you can imagine over time if the volcano decides it's going to eliminate a wall, that would be the end of the wall. This is a very famous place in Iceland called the Blue Lagoon. It's a favorite tourist destination. It's basically a spa, swimming pool, etc. The blue color comes from microbes in the water. It's like a hot tub. and very large. Mary went there the day that I was out with my birding guide, and everybody had a great time there. You can have lunch, you can have spa treatments, et cetera, et cetera. Unfortunately, the volcano started intruding into the Blue Lagoon, so I don't know what the final result of that was. Hopefully it hasn't destroyed that, because that's one of their major tourist attractions in the country. So I want to thank photographers that allowed me to use some of their photos. And thank you for having me. Those are my books. If you haven't been so inclined yet, I'd be happy to sign one for you tonight.
They're wonderful.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Ed.
Any questions?